as the real problematic ones that I think that the vast majority of Israelis and the vast majority of people who care about Israel in this country and other folks would say are a problem and eventually are not going to be part of Israel. The settlements inside the center of Hebron and these other kind of places with outposts and so. And I don't think you distinguish between these two kinds of things.
No, look.
In order, and in a sense, it sort of it feeds to your argument. So
okay, look. Obviously, there are there are different kinds of settlements and different kinds of settlers, and some of the settlements are going to probably remain in Israel. Although it's important to remember that basically the Palestinians have never ever given up on the idea of a one-for-one return, and the more of those settlements Israel keeps, probably the more ultimately of its own land is going to have to give up in the Negev or whatever. But of course there are differences in settlements. But the question that you still have, you've got a quarter according to Akiva Eldar and Edith Zertal, whose I think book Lords of the Land is really the authoritative tome on this, basically who are not people who just were bribed by basically subsidies and commute to Jerusalem, but are really Gush Emunim types. And you have a settlement process that not only has a number of settlers all over the West Bank has not only gone up by about a third between 2000, but is continuing today. I mean, I think it's really important that we not take the Netanyahu government at face value on the settlement freeze. I mean, Yisrael Katz, is Netanyahu's own transportation minister, just said in March, he was quoted in Ma'ariv as saying this, let me quote you, "The construction momentum in Judea and Samaria is the same as when it was at its peak." And that's because, as Yediot reported last December, there was a huge amount of construction that was built, that was created just before they announced the settlement freeze. That construction is now going forward. And, as Netanyahu has said, no, I didn't interrupt you, Eli. And as the settlement, and as Netanyahu and Lieberman have both said, the settlement freeze is not going to be extended after September. In fact, this Israeli government is actually going about trying to legalize certain Israeli illegal outposts. So this good news story that you're telling me about the fact that Netanyahu is committed to the idea of a Palestinian state. I don't think he is. I don't think Sharon was, for that matter, at all. I think there's no evidence that Sharon was. And on the ground, it's becoming...
That's crazy talk. That's nonsense.
Okay, well, let me explain to you. Because when Netanyahu, there were less than 10,000 settlers in Gaza, right? When they were removed, which I think was to the good, Netanyahu's own chief advisor, Doug Weissglass, said basically that part of the reason for doing this was to put the peace process in formaldehyde, so that there would be no peace process. So Sharon wanted a long-term interim agreement which would keep Israel in control of the vast majority of the West Bank. As Akiva Eldar and others have reported, he himself used the word Bantustans in explaining his long-term vision for what Palestine would be like, a whole series of unrelated cantons. There was no fundamental transformation with Ariel Sharon of the kind you're describing. Most of those 10,000 settlers in Gaza actually moved to the West Bank, and the larger context is that the number of settlers between 2000 and 2010 has increased 100,000. So this good news story you're telling me, I so much wish it were true, but I just don't see it.
Okay, I don't think you understand how to read Israeli politics, because you're
referring to... Okay, so please explain
it
to me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm saying Duby Weissglass's interview referring to this line about formaldehyde was done at a time when it was unclear whether or not how much of Likud was eventually going to be in a separate party called Kadima. So he was trying, this is an example of internal Likud politics, and you want to pick and choose one interview. Why didn't you quote Ariel Sharon's actual speeches at the Herzliya conference or later to the Knesset, where he's explaining how disengagement program would not foreclose a two-state solution. Indeed, it's an interim step to make sure that Israel has more secure borders until the final phase of the implementation of the roadmap. The context of Duby Weissglass's speech was really about the Palestinian Authority not getting a concession from Israel until they dealt with the terror problem, which was sort of winding its way down by 2004, 2005. And there was still a very loud voice within Likud that said, give the Arabs nothing until they control terrorism. And it was all about the sequence. So, I mean, I think that that's the way you have to see it. Today, Duby Weissglass, I'm sure if you called him up, would say that Ariel Sharon understood the inevitability of the fact that that Israel was not going to keep most of that land that is held, that Israel won in 1967. And I want to make another point, which I want to make one more point that I think you really gloss over. And that is, until 2005, the only time that Israel had ever dismantled a settlement was in 1978 or 9, after the agreement to give back the Sinai to the Egyptians in the original Camp David Accord. there was a pregnant question throughout the entire peace process, Peter. Will it be possible for the IDF to take on angry settlers? And this confrontation built for a year in Israel. They lined the highways. They protested for an entire year. And Ariel Sharon did it. He also, by the way, dismantled 4 settlements in the northern West Bank. Granted, not the biggest settlements in the world, but to prove the point that the Israeli army could, in fact, take on the fringe of the settler movement that was going to lay down their bodies really to try to stop this. So Israel went through an incredibly traumatic process, and for you to sort of dismiss this as Ariel Sharon, and it sounds to me, honestly, like you like Meretz, you like labor, and everybody who is not on the right side of the political, you're gonna sort of take whatever evidence you can find. Whatever evidence you can find, and you're going to try to make them into some sort of monster.
Look, Eli. There are people who've been on the right side of the process who like Tzipi Livni, even Yitzhak Rabin, who, although he was in labor, was hardly a dove. Who made I think really fundamental transformations, and I applaud them. I would hope for nothing more than to have more Israeli politicians of that Nixon and China variety. But I just simply see no evidence either with Netanyahu or Sharon as much as I would like to. I mean, it is important to remember with both of these guys how deeply, deeply committed and entangled their entire careers are with the deep opposition to a Palestinian state, and particularly in Sharon's case, of course, with a really, really deep connection to the idea that that Israel has a right to settle most of the West Bank, and that in fact it's necessary for Israeli security. You're suggesting. Do you know when was
the last time Israel built a new settlement out in the West Bank? I mean, it depends on, I guess, how you define it. But we're talking about a block of settlements in the metropolitan area of Jerusalem. That's where the settlement activity is. The other stuff that you're talking about is not happening anymore.
There are very large blocks of settlements which go all the way right into the middle, halfway through into the West Bank. In terms of building new land for settlements, I mean, Yesh Din just reported that they've seized Palestinian land for extending Ofra as recently as December of last year. So, again, Netanyahu's own government says the construction in settlements is going on at the highest rate it's ever gone on. This is also what the Israeli human rights groups. But let me just go back to Sharon, because I feel like we keep bouncing around. I just want to go back to this point a little bit. It seems to me, in fact, entirely consistent with the way Sharon has acted, that he would be interested in basically getting rid of, under 10,000 settlers in Gaza at the same time that basically he tries to entrench the vast majority of settlements, including settlements deep into the West Bank. I don't see, and the fact that the Israelis who are most committed to the idea of a Palestinian state generally tend to take that view. I think, let me read the whole Weiss Glass quote, because you said I took it out of context, but let me read the whole thing. You can tell me where you think it's out of context. The significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. When you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Disengagement supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. I think that's genuinely what Ariel Sharon believed, and I fail to see the evidence.
Except Ariel Sharon never said that. Except he never said that. In fact, what he said was, I'm going to withdraw from Gaza, and in the interim, I'm going to have more defensible borders. But this is not precluding. It's not precluding what he said the whole time was the roadmap. And the context of that at the time is a political fight within the Likud party. That you had a prime minister who was willing to break up his own ruling coalition in order to finally dismantle settlements and actually do something instead of talk about it. And you quote something which I think that interview was given at the time to try to placate and win as many members of Likud over to the new Kadima coalition as possible. And it's not I think I would like to go on what Ariel Sharon actually said. Over and over again. I'm doing this because I understand that we need defensible borders for Israel. We can't continue to occupy all this territory. The dream is over, and on and on and on.
When you say that, what are these defensible borders that you're talking about, and how long is this interim period? The interim period you're talking about was in Sharon's mind a decades-long period. You also haven't responded to my.
How do you know that?
To what. Because, in fact, he said that, and that is, I don't have the quote in front of you, but that was clearly his idea about he wanted basically, again, formaldehyde. They wanted a long-term process, basically, in which the Palestinians basically were locked in this position with Israel controlling the large majority of the West Bank. And, as I said, it was reported in Haaretz and elsewhere that Sharon, at various points, this is not back in the 1970s, but this is at exactly the same time, was expressing basically it sketched out this vision to people of many, many, many small Palestinian cantons based on... Go ahead.
Peter, if you're correct, which I'm totally sure you're not, but if you are correct, then why is it that Ariel Sharon agrees to not expand the perimeter of existing settlements on the West Bank, agrees to end pretty much all federal subsidies to settlers, and agrees
He ended federal subsidies for settlers?
Yes, he did. He ended the subsidization and the secret agreements with Bush. Yes, he did. There were a series of these agreements.
That is absolutely not the case. The subsidies, the housing subsidies, the agricultural, the industrial subsidies have not been stopped at all. I mean, the sewage lines, the bus routes, the army protection. All right.
Well, if you're going to include the IDF and the bus protection, but keep in mind also the IDF West Bank.
Why have the settlements? Why have the settlements increased so much?
So to summarize, the Peter Beinart position is. He dismantled some settlements, but he didn't dismantle all of the settlements. Is that your position?
No. The Peter Beinart position is that while I'm glad that Israel got rid of settlements from Gaza, I think what Ariel Sharon was trying to do was to put Israel in a position where it could relieve some of the international pressure and get rid of some of the headache in Gaza, so it could basically squat in the vast majority of the West Bank for decades and decades to come, which I think is actually a much more consistent story with the whole long arc of Ariel Sharon's career than your suggestion of a radical, dramatic shift from a guy who all of a sudden wants to give back the vast majority of the West Bank.
Okay, and let me then reiterate, and then we can close this. I'm basing my position on what Ariel Sharon said at the time, which was we're going to withdraw from Gaza to more defensible borders. This will remove any excuses. He said this will remove any excuses from the Palestinian to continue to support terrorism. And when they stop supporting terrorism, we can move on with the roadmap. And the roadmap has a process, the third phase, which is the negotiation of a two-state solution. So
and the roadmap also says no settlement growth, which continues under Ariel Sharon.
Vast amounts of words from Ariel Sharon, not to mention American, European leaders, the quartet, and everybody else, undercuts, your quote from Doobie Weissglass, which I think it's a radical misinterpretation. And we're clearly not going to disagree.
No. But I'll just end there. It happens to be the interpretation of Sharon's career that I think you would find is widely held amongst those Israelis who actually are passionately in support of a Palestinian state. I think the defensible borders that you're essentially talking about in Sharon's plan are basically borders that include it's nothing like what Barak offered at Taba, but basically the vast majority of settlements in the West Bank, and basically an interim period of decades and decades with no political movement, and that's what I think Weissglass was saying.
Well, all right, we're going to agree to disagree. I think the fact that Sharon mentions the final phase of the roadmap puts us in the context of removing the final excuse for the Palestinians to support terror, which then gets him to the negotiating table, and not to mention everybody else at the time who was involved in the diplomacy of it. And we don't know, by the way, about comparing this against Taba because there was no offer. But we do know that once we got back to Annapolis and once we got to the end of